After the heaps of support I got on my Vanguard video, a lot of you asked me to look at Battlefield 5 as a sort of comparison. And to be honest, I completely forgot Battlefield had a campaign, albeit a short one. But alright, surely this can't be as bad as Vanguard, right? We've already hit the bottom of the barrel. Also, just a preface, apologies for any strange pronunciations, I'll try my best. Under no flag.
Billy Bridger? Says on my pad here, criminal use of explosives, assault, attempted armed robbery, arson, attempted armed robbery. Did you try and rob the same bank 3 times?
No.
Oh, yes, you did. Because you're Billy Bridger. You are the son of big, bad, horrible Arthur Bridger. I'm Arthur fucking Bridger. Give me the fucking money. Now that's your dad, isn't it? So how comes he didn't get sent down with you then?
Because I did all them jobs on your own.
Oh, yeah? I've got a little deal for you. I'm putting together a unit. You're gonna fucking love it. It's right up your street, your sort of thing. And it's got to be better than being in there.
I'll be fine. What sort of unit?
Tell me, Bridger, do you like the seaside?
Do you like the fucking seaside?
This mission puts us in North Africa in 1942 with 2 British SBS members, the Special Boat Service. Now the first thing I want to raise is the recruitment process showcased in the cinematic. I'm not sure that there are any known cases where SBS or even SAS members were recruited straight from prison without already being in the military. Something close to this could have been Paddy Mayne's recruitment to the SAS, or Parachute Unit as it was called at the time. Paddy was a second lieutenant in the 11th Scottish Commandos Unit and was later imprisoned after hitting his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Keyes. Following his imprisonment, he was later recruited by Captain David Sterling to the Parachute Unit and was released from prison. I get the idea that these units would look for particularly troublesome members, those who may not be best placed within regular infantry, but I think grabbing people straight from prison without a military background might be a stretch. If you are aware of any specific person who fits this bill, let me know in the comments. After this cinematic, we're in-game, and something I found really strange was that in the cutscene, our character is seen holding a Sten, which makes sense, very common weapon to be issued to SBS teams. But then in-game it switches us to this drum mag Thompson with some sort of optic. Why? I genuinely don't see the reason they needed to do that. It was perfectly fine. Granted, some SBS units did use Thompsons, however, not with this added crap on it. I feel like we're already going down a particular rabbit hole. The operation that we're executing here isn't out of the realm of possibility, although there may be a few more members to our team, like the 2 we saw at the beginning, wherever they went. SBS and SAS teams covertly assaulted airfields and fuel depots in North Africa and Greece, with many missions being quite successful. Okay, here we go. we have what's labelled as a Commando Carbine, which in real life is also known as the Tirailleur carbine. Now, a couple of issues with this. First of all, the big one really, this is a year too early to be found here. It was designed in 1942, but it wasn't actually deployed to the SOE and Commando units until 1943. Another problem is just the pure rarity of this rifle. 17 were made by Ford Dagenham initially, and an order for 500 was placed in 1944 for the Sterling Armaments Company, but they only ever produced 130. So, let alone the rarity, why is this rifle in a German airbase of all places? But don't worry, you'll notice that we find these weapons in seemingly weirder places later on. Oh, and look at this, we're in Vanguard territory now. An MP40 with a NIDAR reflex sight. Need I say more? Now with this mission, I feel like they've taken inspiration from the previously mentioned missions that the SBS would undertake. The SBS were in operation all across the Mediterranean, and one of their most famous missions was the raid on Castelli airfield. In June 1943, 8 members of the SBS were deployed to occupy Crete in order to mount sabotage raids on the airfields as part of Operation Albumen. Under the command of Lieutenant Anders Larsen, he and his 3 other men, Sergeant Les Nicholson, Corporal Sidney Greaves, and Private Ray Jones, hiked across the rough terrain after paddling ashore using dinghies, eventually reaching the airfield at Castelli. At night, they split into 2 teams and infiltrated the airfield. Larsen and Jones were heading for their target of 8 Stuka dive bombers until they were spotted by an Italian guard, who Larsen shot. With the shot raising the alarm, Larsen and Jones slipped away and took cover. Meanwhile, Nicholson and Greaves had cut through the barbed wire and evaded searchlights. They made their way to the targets and placed explosives on the wings of the aircraft and a fuel dump, then slipped away back across the fence. Larsen and Jones knew they had to fight their way out, so they used grenades and left a trail of explosives across the airfield before sprinting through a hole in the perimeter fence. Upon their rendezvous, the explosives lit up the airfield one by one, destroying their targets, allowing all 4 men to escape mostly undetected. You can see the similarities in a way, but obviously this entire mission was fabricated with elements of real action sprinkled in. The second half of this mission essentially repeats this with another assault on multiple targets, only instead of a team of 4 at night, the game has us go full Superman and take out all 3 positions solo in the daytime. Needless to say, this second half of the mission is wildly all over the place, with me finding STG-44s here, when as previously stated this mission takes place in 1942, and this amazingly stupid moment when the player character uses a German radio to try and contact their ship, as if the Germans wouldn't have been listening, which actually leads us onto the final act, where we have a last stand scenario. Seeing Mason with his headgear in this Kubel wagon reminds me of that photo of SAS soldiers all in a line ready to go, which is probably where, again, the inspiration for elements of this mission likely come from. This last half is mostly fine, I guess, although a couple of points of note. I find it quite hilarious that Mason sets himself up on a high point as kind of a spotter, at one point putting a record on of It's a Long Way to Tipperary. Which he's somehow either carried with him and not broken, or some very naughty German troops have been listening to the enemy's music. But for the most part, he sits up on the high point, snipes maybe 1 or 2 enemies, while us the player single-handedly destroys near enough a division's worth of troops and armor. I guess that's more of a gameplay thing that just really annoyed me while playing. Regardless, it gets to the point where we're outnumbered, but thankfully, the Royal Navy somehow knows our position and bombards the remaining enemy, saving the day. We're given this nice end cutscene with some actual information about the SBS. For the most part, this is correct. Churchill's model of butcher and bolt, or more commonly now known as hit and run tactics, was fundamental to weakening Axis control of certain areas. It helped spread the Axis thinly in certain areas, trying to counter the commando operations. I like having this as an ending cutscene for these missions, as it tries to at least get people interested in these parts of history, and while the gameplay for this mission is a little with its overall accuracy, it plants the seed for people to go and research this for themselves. Nordlys.
Kan jeg fortelle deg en hemmelighet? Jeg har alltid syntes at landet deres er vakkert og forstyrrende. Da jeg kom hit som barn, fortalte de meg historier om skapninger og monster i skogen. Mine egne barn er fortsatt i Tyskland. Jeg savner familien min så veldig. Så nå er jeg her igjen. På jakt etter de monstrene i skogen. For 3 dager siden prøvde en liten britisk kommandotropp å utføre et raid ved hjelp av en tekniker her. Angrepet lyktes ikke. De ble drept, og vi fanget dem. Vi vet at noen er der ute. Bare fortell meg hvem det er.
Now, here's where we get massive problems. I'm going to preface all this mission by saying it's all completely fabricated and deviates from the original actions taken by real Norwegian resistance members and British commandos. Let's first start with what this German officer is saying. He states that a British commando group attempted a raid on the Vemork hydroelectric power plant, but failed, and they were all killed. This is completely wrong. He also states a technician assisted them. In reality, it was a male caretaker known as Johansson. So in the first minute of this cutscene, all wrong. Complete rewrite of history. Why? Well, I'll let the mission continue to run so we can deconstruct it. After skiing down this mountain and making some leg-breaking falls, this lone female resistance fighter makes her way towards the facility. On the way, finding a suppressed Colt 1911 somehow in the middle of Norway, then single-handedly takes out multiple German troops without alerting any of the other checkpoints or posts, until she eventually enters the facility where this dumb scene plays out. This magically spawning German soldier for some reason does not stay back and just shoots the player character. Oh no, he charges with his MP40 so he can get into melee range, and he gets absolutely ruined by this resistance fighter. He of course shoots and alerts the entire facility, and then our character enters the room. Oh yes, it then turns out this resistance fighter is this technician's teenage daughter. So now we team up with our mother and form this power team to fight through hordes of Germans and plant explosives to sabotage this facility. Once done, we make our escape only to be caught on the bridge. In order to make sure the captured intel makes it out, our mother has this ingenious plan.
Forstår du? Jeg elsker deg.
In reality, Solveig has snapped her neck, end of story, game over, roll credits. But no, she miraculously has no injuries, and we begin to make our way through this blizzard. Solveig somehow experiences hypothermia faster than most people, so we need to stay near fires the Germans have lit to keep us from dying. Although I'm quite surprised as the Germans seem to be fine considering most of them aren't wearing all their winter equipment, and our character has gloves, a coat, a hat, and way more to keep her warm. This segment may have annoyed me a little bit. Eventually we reach this waterfall, where we once again fall from a great height, now into water. Now the hypothermia should be setting in. But she pushes through with this ghostly voice of her mother pushing her on until we find this shack, overpower this soldier somehow, and then collapse. How Solveig has the strength to do this after nearly freezing to death and surviving multiple falls is beyond me. The last part of this mission has our character cross-country trek to a frozen port where we now have to destroy all the barrels of heavy water on its way to Germany for the nuclear program. Although I have a tiny problem with this. How are they going to reach Germany when the entire fjord is frozen so the ships can't leave? Fine. Regardless of logic, our character single-handedly takes out an entire depot of soldiers, destroys Gestapo intelligence that's in this remote village for some reason, and then blows up the barrels on this ship. After all this, we infiltrate this bunker, which just has the front door open for some reason, to find our mother being driven away. We give chase, and the Germans decide it would be a good idea to try and hit us with artillery while on the ice. In reality, the Germans do this, the ice breaks, the entire convoy goes down, game over, roll credits. But no, we eliminate this entire camp to then have a U-boat surface from the ice, and in the final cutscene, our mother sacrifices herself to destroy the last barrels of heavy water. Now, after all that, the ending information this game gives drives me insane. Not only are they trying to offer some remembrance to the resistance fighters who lost their lives after making me experience the worst representation of all of it, but they also mention the actual commando attack that happens as a preface to this mission and get it wrong. Let's explain the real history of this mission, shall we? There were a total of 3 operations to disrupt the production of heavy water at Vermork. Operation Grouse, Freshman, and Gunnerside. Grouse and Freshman took place in 1942, where a Norwegian resistance group was dropped as an advanced force outside of Vermork. When they were in place, a party of British engineers would be landed by glider to attack the plant itself. On November 19th, the 2 planned glider-borne landings on the frozen lake Mossvatn took off. However, due to poor visibility and hazardous weather, one of the Halifax planes crashed into the mountain, killing all on board. The glider was cast off, but also crashed nearby. The second Halifax tug decided to return to base, but experienced heavy turbulence, and the tow rope broke and the second glider crashed near the other. Any survivors were captured, tortured, and then executed under Hitler's commando order. The Norwegian team had to hide away in the mountains for 4 months until Operation Gunnerside was put into place. On the night of February 16th, 1943, 6 more Norwegian commandos were dropped by parachute, where they landed successfully and found the previous team. The Vermork power plant had a bridge that went over a nearly 700-foot ravine, and since the previous attempt, security had been increased around the site. The commandos decided to descend into the ravine, ford the river at the bottom, and climb the steep cliff on the far side. Eventually they followed a single railway track straight into the plant without encountering any guards. The group entered the facility via the basement through a window. The only person they encountered was a caretaker named Johansson, who cooperated. They placed explosives on the heavy water electrolysis chambers and lit the fuses. The explosives detonated and destroyed the chambers. The entire inventory of heavy water was destroyed. All members of the commandos escaped, and the operation was a success. The entire operation was bloodless. However, unlike what the game says, while the attack halted production for a few months, the plant was repaired by April and no additional commando attacks would be planned. However, in 1944, Germany would abandon the plant and move any stock of heavy water back to Berlin. Learning of this, the Norwegian resistance and Knut Haukelid, a trained commando, organized to have plastic explosives planted on the ferry that the barrels were being transported on. The explosives went off and all the cargo sank to the bottom of Lake Tin. Now, knowing what we now know about the real operations that took place, why on earth did EA decide to rewrite this history? It serves absolutely no purpose other than to completely forget the actual men whose brave actions actually destroyed the facility and the heavy water. It serves no purpose other than some sort of diversity-filling quota checkmark on the development schedule. I genuinely don't understand why they couldn't have told any other stories about the actual Norwegian freedom fighters. Take the story of Anne Stromsheim, a resistance member who took part in the Battle of Hegra Fortress, the only woman to do so. She saved countless lives as a medic, and even after the surrender, she managed to get other prisoners of war access to medical treatment through the Norwegian Red Cross. Now, while it isn't quite single-handedly sabotaging an entire facility and mowing down hordes of German soldiers, I'd much rather experience her story than this fabricated nonsense. Once again, a game that chooses to rewrite history for political or gameplay reasons, rather than telling the real history of the many brave men and women of the event they're trying to represent. Tirailleur.
regarderai. Des soldats français courageux, prêts à se sacrifier pour leur patrie. Ces hommes, c'étaient des héros. Mais ils n'étaient pas les seuls à combattre. Je vais vous raconter une histoire que vous ne connaissez pas.
This mission puts us in control of a Senegalese Tirailleur, one of the countless colonial forces that took part in the war. And I'm glad to actually play a unit that's often forgot about by various media when talking about World War II. These Senegalese forces saw extensive service in West Africa, Italy, and Corsica, and as we see in this cutscene, they assisted in the liberation of southern France. These men fought from Toulon to the Swiss border between August and November 1944, and the Tirailleurs didn't just fight in World War II. Colonial forces had been used as far back as the Crimean War in 1854. In World War I, the French deployed around 450,000 troops from Africa: Senegalese, Algerians, Tunisians, Moroccans, and Somalis, most of whom would see deployment in Europe. Following World War I, French African troops would serve as an occupation force in the German Rhineland, which would lead to horrendous propaganda circulating through Germany during the lead up to World War II. Events such as the Chasselet massacre would be an almost direct result of what happened during the occupation. So far, we see that these soldiers have been designated to logistical tasks, which isn't uncommon for colonial soldiers during this time. As you'll probably know, the US segregated black soldiers during World War II and used them to serve in more logistical roles, so this wouldn't be too far-fetched to believe. This line here, you won't find this story in the history books, is something I do have a problem with. Outside of the fact that this particular mission is fabricated, there are plenty of books that talk about these actions and accounts of Senegalese soldiers during the countless wars they've taken part in, such as these books here. I understand that while they may have less written about them, I do feel that's pushing it a little bit too hard though. Once we're in game, it's good to see we're actually using French weaponry like the Chausha light machine gun, and for the most part the first half of this mission is fine. There isn't anything particularly glaring or outrageous, so good job Battlefield. Then in the second part of this mission, we find a rather grisly sight. As I mentioned previously, the Germans were barbaric when it came to the colonial troops. Often any surrendering African soldiers would be captured and executed on the spot due to the intense hatred the Germans had for those they considered inferior. So what we see here in the game is unfortunately pretty accurate to how these Germans would handle colonial forces. Onwards from this, we take out an anti-air position, which again doesn't have anything particularly glaring in it, so again, great job so far. In our final act, however, we begin our assault on a German-held chateau, where our character has two rather interesting weapons. We have our exceedingly rare commando carbine somehow, and a German EMP with a NIDAR sight. We are doing so well. There's also Germans here wearing this funky looking camo, which I could only attribute to some sort of bastardization of the Plattenmuster pattern worn by the Waffen-SS. If you do know what this exact camo pattern is, and I've mislabeled it, please let me know in the comments. I'm actually genuinely curious. As we fight towards the chateau, we find something that was in the previous mission, but we get a nice closer look at it, which is an SD KFZ 251 with the mounted Werfrahmen 40, one of the many multiple rocket systems developed during this war. Probably the more famous example of one of these would be the BM-13 Katyusha, or even the Sherman Calliope. From my very quick inspection, this seems to be relatively well modelled, and it's a system I haven't seen in many other World War II based games. As we approach the gates, we do have a moment which I think is slightly ridiculous.
Poussez-toi!
Personally, I would have stood behind the firing of this Pak-40 rather than right next to the door, but sure, it's not like a slight deviation in aim could have obliterated either of us here. And then after this, we have a moment with this Tiger tank. Two things. First of all, surely someone on this front-mounted machine gun would have got either of us, considering we're just sitting in front of it. And two, what kind of supercharged grenade did he throw in there to blow the turret off? And if it was that powerful, or if he somehow managed to hit the ammunition, I guess, then how is he not in multiple pieces around me? He should be almost a fine mist. As we enter this final cutscene, one last thing about the gameplay is what's with these flags? I don't understand why they chose to use these flags, considering that the swastika banner had replaced it by 1933. Another unnecessary slip up here.
Messieurs, nous sommes fiers de vous et de ce que vous avez accompli.
Merci, mon commandant.
Faisons une photo pour la postérité.
Quand l'armée française a libéré Paris, ils ont retiré tous les soldats noirs. Ils les ont remplacés par des visages plus familiers. Mais moi, je sais ce qu'on a fait. Et à quel prix. Et j'en suis fier.
Now, there's a couple of things to unpack with this ending cinematic. First of all, I find the erasing of black soldiers from the photograph, which I think is meant to symbolize their efforts being forgotten or unwritten, is somewhat valid, but also slightly exaggerated. There are plenty of accounts written about what these soldiers accomplished and their rich history in the colonial forces of France. You could argue that in mainstream media, such as movies and games, they are largely unheard of. But you could argue the same thing for the countless other colonial forces of not just France, but Britain too. I think their inclusion in this game is a boon to their representation, but we should also focus on the other aspects of their treatment as well. One of these aspects which is mentioned is how the colonial troops were not permitted to march alongside their white counterparts after the liberation of Paris, which wasn't just the orders of the French army, but of overall Allied command too. Charles de Gaulle made it clear he wanted French units leading the liberation of Paris. And Allied command agreed, but on one condition. De Gaulle's division must not contain any black soldiers. This was confirmed by Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Major Walter Bedell Smith, who wrote a confidential memo which stated, "It is more desirable that the division mentioned above consists of white personnel." Since World War I, the French army had been mixed with almost every division containing a colonial element, and given that Britain also didn't segregate its army, you might expect that we would have objected, but this is not the case. In order to appease Allied command and to have his French units leading the liberation, De Gaulle removed all black soldiers from the division and replaced them with units as far as North Africa and the Middle East. In fact, the player character Deme Cissé, I believe, is based on the real soldier Issa Cissé, who is quoted as saying, "We were colonized by the French. We were forced to go to war, forced to follow orders that said, do this, do that, and we did. France has not been grateful, not at all." And to be fair, not only were the black soldiers not permitted to march with their fellow soldiers in Paris, but following this, de Gaulle implemented a policy known as blanchiment, in which colonial troops were replaced with newly recruited partisans and volunteers. Alongside this, France refused to pay wage arrears to prisoners of war, which led to several incidents of violence, such as the Tirailleur massacre in 1944. The French killed between 35 and 150 Senegalese soldiers. Overall, I did enjoy this mission. While it did have some minor mistakes here and there, I do believe that it's a great addition to represent one of the many colonial forces that took part in World War II. And while the events that took place in the game are fabricated to my knowledge, it does a great job at trying to illustrate the bravery these men had and the outrageous treatment they experienced after the war.
Als ich ein Kind war, wurde eine Gruppe von Jungs im Dorfladen beim Klauen erwischt. Mein Vater war außer sich, als er davon erfuhr. Aber ich hab doch gar nichts gestohlen. Vielleicht, sagte er. Aber du warst dort. Mein Name ist Peter Müller. Kommandant des Tigerpanzers 237. Und ich war dort.
Now we come to the last mission in Battlefield 5's story, and in my opinion, the best. We play Peter Müller, commander of Tiger Tank 237, and we're placed in early 1945, in the Rhineland-Ruhr region, as Germany is on the back foot and approaching defeat. The city this mission takes place in bears resemblance to Cologne due to the bridge and cathedral we'll see later on. And given the amount of enemy tanks we'll come across here, I think that's essentially what this mission is based on. Within this mission, we have our panzer crew, Müller as commander, Kurtz as driver, and the two gunners, Schroeder and Hartmann, both seeming to come from the Hitler Youth, given how young they look. Each of these characters seem to represent the various stages that the German army was in around this time. Schroeder is a devout and brainwashed hardline Nazi. He's been brought up with the propaganda of the regime and is fanatical to the end. Hartmann is also a young man, brought up the same as Schroeder. However, he represents the fear that many of the young would have, being drafted into the military to fight to the bitter end. He is a scared and nervous wreck being forced to fight for the dying regime. Kurtz is a jaded older man. He's not afraid to speak his mind, and he knows where the war is heading, but he holds loyalty to Müller and his tank. And finally, Müller, a somewhat level-headed commander, not entirely fanatical to the regime, but will still hold his loyalty above all else. As we watch further into this cutscene, we get a sense of the desperation the Germans have, with their ruthless policy of executing deserters and traitors to the fatherland. By 1942, desertions in the German army would increase, and it would only go up further following the Normandy landings, and then the push into Germany itself. It's estimated that at least 15,000 German soldiers were executed for desertion throughout the war. As we move further along in the game, we come across the yet again varied German flags, with the Imperial Standard and the alternative Reich banner. I still find it so strange that both are used. It's also quite jarring not having the actual flag represented. I understand you can't sell games and media in places like Germany if you have the swastika present, which I find incredibly dumb, but that's the whole other issue. It just stifles such a simple accuracy that would make the setting feel more authentic. Throughout this mission, we come across numerous American forces, including Sherman tanks, and for the most part there's nothing outlandishly inaccurate, so it gives me a chance to talk about the actual Battle of Cologne. Under Operation Lumberjack, the 3rd Armoured Division, 104th Infantry Division, and the 9th Armoured Division were tasked with capturing the city of Cologne between the 5th and the 7th of March 1945, with the 3rd attacking from the northwest, the 104th from the west, and the 9th clearing the south. One particular skirmish within the city that I think serves as one of the biggest inspirations for this mission is one between a German Panther tank and a US Pershing tank, all of which was captured on video by a US cameraman. The German Panther was in an ambush position near the Cologne train station, with 2 advancing Shermans being slowed down by the rubble. The Shermans were stuck down the narrow streets, making them easy targets for the Panther's 75mm shells, 2 hitting the lead Sherman's turret and a 3rd hitting the tracks of the Sherman behind. The lead Sherman was effectively destroyed and 3 of the crew had been killed. A nearby Pershing tank was called in to take out the Panther. The Pershing drove on a street parallel to the Panther. When it reached the junction, it stopped briefly, aimed when it saw the Panther, and kept moving forward and fired a direct hit. With the Panther crew jumping out of their burning tank, the Pershing fired additional direct hits, and the tank was disabled. As we move forward, we get a cutscene where our Tiger has to dart out of the way of Allied air support, although the plane here should probably be a Typhoon, minor point I know. We also get a good look inside the tank, and it's fairly decently modelled. We send out Jittery Hartman, who, while trying to get us a way out, seemingly disappears. Spotting Allied forces, we make our way out and fight our way to the headquarters at the cathedral. We pass through the death and destruction with propaganda messages blaring, alongside our own soldiers hung for desertion. Again, amplifying the desperation for order and loyalty until we find young Hartman among the dead. As we approach the cathedral, we find that the defences are abandoned and Kurtz and Muller are slowly losing hope, while our fanatical crewmate Schroeder stays ever loyal. We are met with an overwhelming American force, and we fight our way out. Again, almost paying homage to the aforementioned tank duel, only we're seeing it from a different perspective. We make for the bridge until...
Die haben uns verraten. Die haben die Brücke gesprengt. Die wollen uns hier verrecken lassen.
Das weißt du nicht, Kurtz. Komm, wir müssen jetzt...
Was? Stärke zeigen. Hä? Herrgott doch mal. Sieh dich doch um, Peter. Gott, steh uns bei. Alles, woran wir geglaubt haben. Alles, was wir dafür getan haben. Es ist vorbei.
Nein, Kurtz. Komm. Tu das nicht, Kurtz.
Peter, es ist vorbei.
Er war ein Verräter.
Kurtz! Kurtz!
Ich weiß, er war ein Freund, aber er ist desertiert. Gemeinsam sind wir stärker, richtig? Die Schwachen überleben nicht. Das waren doch ihre Worte, oder? Sagen Sie es! War das nicht so? Just give up, damn it! Wieder nicht geglaubt! Sie sollten jetzt zurück in den Panzer steigen!
This mission is such a contrast to the god-awful Nordlys one. First of all, the fact that we're experiencing it from the Germans' perspective is already something unique for a franchise such as Battlefield. It tries to portray the ever-falling hope of the German soldiers, and those who did hold on were the most die-hard indoctrinated members, either the young who were brought up with the regime, or simply the most fanatical. It somewhat humanizes the enemy. While they were capable of horrendous things, at the end of the day, they're just men. It shows the levels that Hitler and his regime were willing to go in an effort to continue a war they were very clearly losing, all due to his fanaticism and his ego. He didn't care about the German citizens. He poured every resource he could into his war effort and his extermination programs, right up until he put a bullet in his brain. The Last Tiger is a fantastic attempt at trying to represent the desperation and hopelessness that filled the German army in 1945, alongside the dogma of others. The depression and defeatism. My only problem with this is that they essentially refuse to acknowledge the causes. There's no mention of Nazism's failings, no mention of the regime these men were supposedly dying for. It feels like they somewhat skirt around that truth. There's no call out for the crimes committed in the name of the fatherland, or the representation of symbolism of the regime. While The Last Tiger outshines the other missions greatly, it still has many flaws, but it can almost be forgiven for the raw emotion felt in the end and its storytelling, combined with a beautiful soundtrack and the uniqueness of showcasing the war from a German perspective. So Battlefield 5, is it as bad as Vanguard? No, not by a long shot. While the Nordlys mission brings it down heavily, I do think the other three missions at least attempt to tell true history with elements of reality combined with other aspects to make gameplay interesting. Battlefield 5 is also far from perfect as a representation of World War II. It has many flaws, but the storytelling of The Last Tiger, seeing the war from the German perspective, representation from a colonial army, and discussing the commandos all makes a great taster for learning more about their history. And the endings that give facts about these elements is a great touch. It drives people to research these aspects themselves. I have to commend Battlefield for at least trying to drive people to do their own research into these topics. While I still find it hard to believe that the same writers for Nordlys came up with The Last Tiger, 3 missions out of 4 isn't bad for a short campaign. And because these missions aren't trying to represent actual events, but instead take inspiration from them and recreate them, I find that far better than Vanguard's approach. It doesn't have to mess with the timeline of events or anything like that, and while it does add certain weapons and attachments where they shouldn't be, it's again much tamer than Vanguard's egregious crimes. Overall, I'll say good job Battlefield 5. You didn't come last, and you at least tried. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this content and want to see more, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future content. Also, don't forget to leave a like and a comment telling me what you'd like to see next. I'd love to hear your suggestions. I also have a Discord now open to all subscribers, so if you're interested in just chatting, sharing your thoughts and ideas, the link is in the description. I hope to see you there. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.